You are listening to Mindshack. This is your host, Bruce McGuire. Simple and Scary is the name of the game today. Are we witnessing the collapse of Western civilization in real time? Now, this is a topic that's come up here and there. I've touched upon it here and there, but I want to tackle it now. The end of 2023, as opposed to what it looked like, I guess, anywhere from 2012 to 2022. What are the differences in 2023 and beyond? That is what we'll be taking a look at in typical Mindshock fashion, with logic and reason at the forefront. If you want to help support the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Help logic and reason return to a world where it is quickly going extinct, and that might actually be part of the reason for the incoming collapse, if there is one. And I will, of course, also touch upon the resurgency of a certain percentage of the use of logic and reason. Again, we don't fall for false dichotomy logical fallacies here. More than one thing can be true at a time. More than one group of people can be influential at a time. More than one thing can be going on at a time. You could also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube. Help support the channel that way. Get access to exclusive streams and chats. Make sure you're subscribed. Hit the bell for notifications. If they're still not coming through, make sure to like and comment on more videos. That's how the YouTube algorithm works. Like and share Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case, topic, logical analysis, co-podcast, or requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. All right, so what's the difference here? People have been saying this for a number of years. I don't remember the exact year where it kind of sort of went mainstream. I suppose the earliest grumblings probably were even in the 80s and 90s by hardcore conspiracy theorists like Bill Cooper and the like. David Icke, Alex Jones have long been talking or raving about, however you want to look at it, the decline. Now, is that the same as collapse in real time? I don't know. But when you're talking about something like a snowball effect, if it's just a tiny, tiny little snowball, it's kind of like nobody notices. But when it becomes this massive, massive snowball avalanching throughout the entire mountain, and now everybody can not only see and hear it, but they can feel it from the incoming earthquakes as a result of it, since it's so big. At that point, we can say that even the average goof, even Joe Schmo, is witnessing the collapse in real time. Is there a specific year where we can see that this has happened with Western civilization? Now, for those that don't know and never heard of Camille Paglia, she's actually made some interesting parallels between the collapse of ancient Rome, or the purported collapse of ancient Rome. Again, this is Mindshock, where we do not claim anything is true or untrue. We don't fall for any of these silly fallacies. If there was some kind of a mud flood, reset, Tartaria, altered history not as we know it, not the official history you see at the Idiot Box, or the official history recorded by the victors in government indoctrination facility textbooks. Because, quite a shocker, some of that might not be true. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But obviously the history books write, the victors write the history books. And I don't know, there's still gullible goofs out there that hallucinate that the victors would never change or alter anything to make them look more favorable after the fact, particularly if they were really the bad guys and they wanted to reframe themselves as the good guys. Not rocket science, but no shortage of goofs who can't grasp very basic concepts. The coincidence there is the authority-worshipping cultists and their ilk. Okay, so with Paglia, what did she really observe? The breakdown, she kind of pinpointed it. And I'll actually do a book summary of her book. I've been doing a lot of book summaries, so you can check those out. Instead of reading a book, I know some people just don't like to read, or they like to read, but they simply don't have the time, and their time is so limited, or they have a really short commute, so they really can't even make it through a 10 or 12 hour audiobook. So the audio summaries here on Mindshock, you could check those out. Most of them are an hour or less, unless it's, really, really in depth. I mean, I try to cover all the points, so they might be a little bit longer, but probably anywhere between 5 and 10 times shorter than an audiobook, but touching upon all the main points, so you can learn quite a lot in a very small amount of time. And of course, the lazy people will appreciate it, but I do want to recognize that not everybody's lazy. Some people are just extremely short on time. So Paglia touches upon kind of not only the degradation of the culture as a whole, just a disintegration into debauchery and the like, just moral decay, but specifically the family unit, gender roles, all of this transgender issues. Ancient Rome went through it as well. And are we seeing a mirror effect here in the Western world, the US, the UK, with this transgenderism propaganda just pushing it? And is that a facilitator of civilization collapse? Because you see these other countries where this is not going on, certain Middle Eastern countries, China, some of these just really powerful countries that are, now there's obviously different facets and variables, but in certain ways, they are not, I mean, they're declining in certain ways as well, but they're also climbing in a lot of ways, economically and otherwise, where the U.S. seems to be declining. I mean, I'm not going to get into BRICS and all of that, but the U.S. was once looked upon as the reserve currency and just extremely powerful. That's not really the case anymore. So a lot of these other countries, these powerhouse countries, they're not really looking to the US and the UK anymore. I mean, Australia is kind of weird. We're not going to really get into Australia and New Zealand right now, but yeah, mostly the US, Canada, the once semi-great nation of Canada, nowhere near the case now, and the UK. So are we seeing some parallels here of just flat out absurdity being pushed as normal? And the hallucination that anybody not going against the absurdity is somehow violating human rights. I mean, that's just the most insane notion. If you haven't checked out the podcast on pronouns and the gender issues on Mindshock, I did a logical analysis on this. Let's say somebody wants you to call their cat a dog and their dog a cat, because that's how they subjectively perceive their pet's identifying as. Now, just because you refuse to go along with the delusion and mental illness, that doesn't mean you're against the cat or against the dog. That doesn't mean you want to violate any of their animal rights in any way. And just the irony of all of these goofs being too bigoted and prejudiced against people who have traditional viewpoints, or in this case, empirically verifiable definitions in any dictionary or encyclopedia from any culture throughout the ages. So yeah, there's definitely an intolerance of not just traditional viewpoints, but flat out common sense. There's just all this bigotry against common sense and people promoting common sense these days. So is that all part of a real-time collapse? And is it also not that simple? Because you're seeing a lot of social unrest as well. So people, it's kind of crazy how normalized it is. Because in decades past, yeah, there was some here and there, but now you have just completely collapsed, failed cities like San Francisco, Chicago, Baltimore. You have some of these just completely failed cities, ironically, with Democratic leadership. Again, this isn't a political podcast. I do not advocate for voting or violence or extortion or theft of any kind. Do not advocate for Democrats or Republicans, neither sect of the statism cult. I'm just clearly pointing out basic facts, because the illogicality of Democrats to pretend that red states have all this high level of violence when obviously states are made up of cities and state capitals, which have vastly different laws, particularly in the area of gun control, as the rest of the state. And all of the statistics are being accrued in these murder capitals like Baltimore and Chicago. And now is San Fran like the theft capital now? I mean, it's getting pretty crazy in some of these failed cities. And in the past, I mean, I don't know if people would view upon it. I mean, there's a certain there's a certain amount of apathy that's just been increasing. I don't want to pinpoint, but, somewhere around 9/11. Although, to be fair, I guess you could say it possibly started before then. You could say maybe the second half of the 90s. The first half of the 90s was pretty cool. The 80s was pretty cool. But the second half of the 90s, particularly the late 90s, there was a little bit of creep. You could say grunge music, a certain disassociation. And I mean, is it coincidental that it was with the rise of the popularity of the internet? Because in the very early 90s, the internet was a thing. The internet was a thing in the 80s and even the 70s, but not really for the majority of people. It wasn't so much in the public sphere of consciousness. And in the late 90s, it was getting there. It was getting there. I mean, even had romantic comedies like You've Got Mail coming out. So the internet, social media, the precursor to social media, forums and email lists and all these things, discussion groups online, the precursor to the Facebooks and the Twitters and the Instagrams and all that. Is that all mere coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not going to go into that. I'm not going to really go down that too much right now. But there has been a rise in apathy to the point, and also the thing is, there's so much drastic difference in certain communities. I mean, you have some kind of certain communities, just really upscale, sheltered communities where nothing ever gets stolen. There's no violent crime. And it's kind of crazy because looking back through the 70s and 80s, true crime has a little bit to do with it as well. Just the rise of the serial killer phenomenon and missing children being more publicized. Obviously, it always happened, but, you had milk carton kids and all that. There was a certain loss of innocence in Americana, so to speak, in small town America, where people used to leave their doors open and all that stuff. That kind of started changing in the 70s and the 80s and was definitely changed by the 90s. So just to add a little bit of reference here. Now we're in 2023, 2024. It's definitely a different world. And this civil unrest, I mean, you might be able to pinpoint mass civil unrest to even BLM. Because before that, it seemed to have been more isolated. With BLM, you have more of a orchestrated, coordinated attack of civil unrest and burning down places and cars and all of this. It never really stopped en masse. It quieted down, but never really stopped. And now we have a world where you have looting in just certain cities, certain areas of certain cities, and everybody's just kind of blasé and apathetic about it. Is the apathy itself a sign of civilization collapse in real time? Because as this spreads to more and more cities, I mean, what's going to happen? Is this really just opening the door to some kind of militaristic police state and a new world order? And whether or not this collapse or decline is a coordinated, whether or not it's an intentional effort by certain powers that be, I'm not really going to get into that. For the purpose of this podcast. You could check out many others, including the Bill Cooper podcast and all of those factors. But for the purpose of this one, is it simply what are we witnessing? Is it the collapse itself? I mean, everything from education to, or so-called education, indoctrination facilities, the government being in charge of educating children. I mean, wow, can anybody think of a worse idea? The most destructive force in history, responsible for over 200 million murdered civilians just this past century, being in charge of education. Wow. I mean, wow. I don't know if anybody could think of a worse idea or a worse entity to be in charge of educating the next generation, or indoctrinating rather. So you're also looking at economical factors, just the rising cost of living. Now, this is something a lot of people are talking about, and with rent prices, home prices, just the cost of food, the cost of gas, the cost of utilities, the cost of everything. The cost of living is skyrocketed, while wages remained mostly the same, or if they're slightly increasing, they're nowhere near matching the rise of inflation, the greatest tax. So I talked about this in a bunch of podcasts. I mean, not even just 80, 90 years ago, not even 100 years ago, you could buy a house and a car outright. You could buy it outright with a regular job. Not the bottom of the bottom, but not the top of the top, just a mediocre job. And you could have and support a family. You could have a home, a car, and support a family on a single income. A single middle range income. And even really low income jobs, you could still have it. You just might have to save for more than a year or two. Whereas with a regular job, I mean, homes were what? Between 5 and 10,000. Cars, half of that, less than half of that. So literally, with just a year, saving just 1 year, you could afford these things with a regular job. How crazy is that to think about? I mean, if the average goof just stopped to think about that, would they be outraged? I mean, most goofs might not even know that, or not know the purchasing power of the dollar not even 100 years ago. It's crazy stuff, man. It's crazy stuff. I mean, and even older people, like when you were a little kid, all the older people, older than, let's say, even 20 or 30, how much did a can of soda or a piece of candy cost when you were a little kid? How much does it cost now? How much does it cost now? I mean, it's just flat out insanity that the people aren't revolting outright against these masters and controllers, the so-called powers that be, the social engineers, just pushing everybody deeper and deeper into slavery and debt. Is this what real-time collapse looks like? Now, the final point I want to touch on here is so-called climate issues. So I don't want to go down the rabbit holes of the arsonists trying to push some climate change agenda and all these tax grifters pushing the climate cult propaganda. We're not going to get into that. Just the point that there is mass devastation. It kind of doesn't really matter for the main point here, whether it's natural or not. I mean, obviously, HAARP is a thing. I will be doing a dedicated episode on HAARP. I mean, even just back in the 90s, this was already admitted by the Defense Department in the U.S. that there are electromagnetic-based weapons that cause earthquakes, volcano eruptions, and storms. This was admitted on record in the 90s. I know people are going to want a source on this. I'm going to address it in the following podcast. I've dropped a link to government documentation on this and transcripts of all of this. To those in the know, this isn't a shocker. I mean, there's over 100 years of cloud seeding technology being utilized. I mean, none of this is really a shock other than to maybe the most devout coincidence theorists and authority worshipping cultists, just these brainless goofs who can only watch mainstream news. But other than those goofs, I mean, it's all those goofs, it's all fairly well known. So is this also all part of the collapse? And there's actually another point I didn't really get into. Plagues. Also, whether man-made, manufactured or not. Just look at what's going on in the past, let's say 5 years, and compare it to the previous, because people are like, oh, this always happened. Yes, it did. But let's talk scale. Let's compare. What are the control levels? What are the outlier events? Because obviously there were many plagues throughout the past century. Is it all part of resets? You haven't checked out the Mud Flood Altered History Reset podcast on Mindshock. Check that out. It could also have something to do with this. There are a lot of overlapping variables here that we discuss on Mindshock because we don't fall for appeal to incredulity fallacies or any of these other silly fallacies the gullible goofs fall for. So all of this is kind of happening simultaneously and at a rate much greater than in the past. Is that a sign of real-time civilization collapse? Now, let's not fall for appeal to extreme logical fallacy. That doesn't mean the entire human race is going to go extinct. There are other areas of the world that are prospering. Non-Western countries are prospering. Why is that? A lot of factors, but this podcast is about the collapse of Western civilization. So circling back to the very beginning, not just with the transgender agenda or whatever you want to call it, but also feminism has been taking its toll the past few decades. I mean, just the quality of life and index of happiness has plummeted since the rise of feminism. Is that a coincidence? Maybe. I'm not claiming it is or it isn't. This is mind check. I'm not claiming anything is true or untrue. I'm just examining timelines and different theories because it does seem to be coincidental if it's not related. Because in a more traditional society, you had a balanced economy. When government was thieving from the citizenry under the guise of calling it taxes to a lesser extent than now, obviously they've been doing that for a long time, but it was to a much lesser extent. You didn't have the government involved in everything. The more the government gets involved, the more everything collapses. The more some of these destructive ideologies take hold, and not just take hold, but are actively pushed on the majority of the population. I know I said I was gonna round this out. Final point here. I want to keep this one pretty short just to keep everybody's attention. I know some people complain about the 15-hour plus ones, but but here, okay, this is the final point here. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So feminism, let's say it's going to help 0.1, 0.01, 0.001% of the female population because they're just not cut out for the family life. They really would be happier in the workplace. Now, here's the point nobody talks about. This was always true. I mean, even centuries ago, you had these prominent female figures that just rose and had an impact on humanity. I mean, everything from powerful queens to scientists and nurses and just women who made a difference. That was their calling. Nobody stopped them. I mean, yes, some people were trying to stop them, but not more so than people try to stop a man. In fact, probably less so. They'd probably be less likely to be assassinated or met with violence than a man. Obviously, men are the victims of 80 to 90% of all violent crime throughout history. So females have always had a chance. See, the thing is with controls, what a lot of goofs don't understand, especially the so-called women's rights activists, they claim that women were oppressed in the past, which is true. The thing they don't talk about is they weren't oppressed as much as the men, because the men were vastly oppressed. Because obviously statism and the cult of governments, that's always been the number one enemy of mankind throughout history and responsible for most of the evil throughout history. So that's obvious to anybody who's cracked any history book. So to claim that women were discriminated against because they were women, yeah, that's true on a certain level, just like men have always been discriminated against because they're men. Being drafted for war, or even in the ancient history, I mean, most militaries in the ancient world were not comprised of females. Although you probably could find some female units. I mean, I don't know if those accounts are true from the past in history. Maybe they are. I don't know. There are some warrior queens and such. So to say that was impossible, I mean, it's just so silly. Or that females couldn't own land when there's all these landowners from hundreds of years ago. I mean, just because it wasn't the majority, but if the majority weren't so inclined, why would they do it? Now, basically, it's like all of these ideological cultists, they want to push this ideology on the 99.9% that's going to make them more miserable. So now you have a result of both men and women being much more miserable, the index of happiness plummeting since these ideologies of feminisms and socialism has been pushed in the Western world. Is that all coincidental? Maybe, maybe not. This is mind check. I'm not claiming anything is true or true. I'm just observing the variables, observing the timelines, and analyzing several different theories, some of which are mutually exclusive. So just this widespread extortion, nobody looks at that, where feminism has also enabled the cult of government to extort under the guise of taxes from the entire female population. And if you are of the sharing the theory that the family unit, the nuclear family, is the basis of a solid civilization, as has been the case through history. I mean, maybe we're living in magical times now where it's not the case, but it's been the case throughout history. So it would appear that feminism and socialism and nanny state governments, this has all led to the collapse, and we're kind of seeing it in real time. We are seeing it in real time which is kind of disturbing, particularly even myself. Now, I don't consider myself a devout coincidence theorist by any stretch of the imagination, but I can't lie. I did think it was possibly an exaggeration in previous years when people were saying we're witnessing the collapse in real time. But now I'm not so sure. I really don't know. If it does turn out that we're witnessing the collapse in real time, it wouldn't surprise me in 2023, 2024. It kind of surprised me a little in years past. All the Mindshock listeners can share their own thoughts, theories, and opinions on these matters. Are we witnessing the collapse in real time?